Hey, this is David Weller from the Old Cannon Armory. In this video, we're going to talk briefly about disassembling the AR-15 lower. In particular, we're going to focus on removing the stock and the receiver extension assembly. We'll also talk about how to remove the grip assembly. We'll talk about the hammer and trigger assembly removal, as well as the safety selector. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the process of actually removing the takedown pin and the pivot pin. Before we begin the disassembly process, let's talk about the kinds of tools you'll need. Over here on the left-hand side, you'll see a standard AR-15 armorer's tool. Pretty simple tool you can get for anywhere from $10 to $20 online. In particular, as we remove the receiver extension, we're going to use the castle nut part of this tool to remove that. If you don't have a tool like this, you could go to a local hardware store, pick up basically a band wrench, and use that for removing the castle nut. But generally, I recommend you spend the money to go ahead and get yourself a basic armorer's tool. You'll also want a hammer that has a non-marring surface, like in this particular case, this has a nylon head on it. You'll also need a hex wrench, 3/16. You'll need some pin punches between 1.5 millimeters to 4 millimeters. You'll also probably want a small screwdriver to help you out with the process of removing the pivot pin. And I'm actually going to show you how to use a pretty basic thing here called a clevis pin for also reinserting the pivot pin. It's kind of a difficult process. You can buy some fancy tools online from different places, but for about $1.50 at your local hardware store, you can use one of these and it works great. Last but not least, you'll probably want some place to store your parts as you're taking things apart. You're going to have some small things like detent pins and small springs. You're going to need some place to safely keep those during your disassembly process. So before we begin to remove the receiver extension and the stock back here, we need to take out the buffer and the recoil spring. Now just remember that in this process, the recoil spring does have tension put on it. So as we take it out, you have to be careful as it tries to pop out. The way to remove this is to depress the buffer retention spring, or I'm sorry, the buffer retention pin right here, and then allow the buffer to come out. And the way to do this is to push the buffer in, take that tension off of the actual buffer retention spring, depress it with a simple flat-bladed screwdriver. Remove the screwdriver, and then allow the buffer and the recoil spring to come out, just like that. Our next step is to loosen the castle nut that holds the receiver extension and the stock. And one of the things that I talked about earlier was the use of a simple AR-15 armorer's tool that would be able to actually fit over the castle nut and remove it. That process is pretty simple. You just match the teeth up to the actual castle nut part, and then just apply enough pressure to loosen the actual nut itself, just by a simple turn like this. Once you've removed enough pressure on it and you can hand untighten it, that's the best time to stop with this. And I'll explain that in just a little bit. The other thing that you can do in order to remove the tension on that castle nut is to use a inexpensive basically rubber removal wrench. You can kind of use these as a substitute for like a pipe wrench. Some people have actually been successful loosening the castle nuts using things like a vice grip wrapped with electrician's tape. I don't necessarily recommend that. The actual AR-15 armorer's tool are really inexpensive. They're about anywhere from $10 to $15, $20 maybe, and I strongly suggest that you invest in it if you're going to go into a process like this. So after we've got this part done, all we then need to do is just loosen the actual castle nut itself. Now we're ready for the next step, where we're going to be removing the actual receiver extension and pulling some key parts out that we need to actually take out the takedown pin itself. Now that the castle nut has been moved back, what we want to do is loosen this back plate up here. Now right about in this spot is where the takedown spring is at, along with the takedown pivot pin, and it's pressing up against the actual takedown pin itself. So as we loosen this back plate, remember that there's a spring right behind it, and you want to make sure that you don't loosen the back plate up so much that the spring comes out and goes flying around. So the first thing we want to do is just get a little small screwdriver in there. Just move this back plate back just a little bit. And then you'll see the spring right there as it starts to come back. Now remember that this back plate is designed to just come straight back. So you just want to gradually take that pressure off. That spring will be pushing back on it. You just want to take that pressure off. Then you can unscrew the castle nut the full distance and then just allow that back plate to come back until you see that there's no more pressure that's being put on the actual spring itself. Now that the back plate has been moved off, what we want to do is actually take out the receiver extension and the stock. Before we do this, keep in mind that this buffer retention pin right here still has some spring tension on it, and it's being held in place by the receiver extension, which is holding this down. So as we unscrew the receiver extension, it's going to remove pressure from this buffer retention spring. So we want to make sure we capture this as we unscrew the receiver extension. So all we're going to do is just simply put our finger on there and then slowly but surely unscrew it. We're going to go just far enough where you can actually feel that spring, or the buffer retention pin and the spring coming out, and then we'll just take this out. And again, remember, it's both a pin and a spring. And then we'll store this in our little storage area for whatever our parts are for our in-progress parts. Once we've carefully removed the buffer retention pin and spring, now we want to take out the takedown spring, which is right here. Carefully remove that. Now remember that inside here is still a detent. We can remove now the actual takedown pin, which is right back here. The detent itself should not be applying too much pressure, so we should be able to just simply remove this. Now again, remember, the takedown detent is still inside, and we need to remove the assembly and then tilt it down so that the detent pin falls into our hands. I'll let you do that yourself. So at this point in time, let's quickly review the kinds of parts we have left. Aside from the receiver extension and the stock, you should still have sitting outside the buffer retention pin, the buffer retention spring, the takedown pin detent, and the takedown spring.